Joining me now is our first political panel for the afternoon, Liberal MP Trent Zimmerman and Labor MP Graham Perrett. Thanks both for your time. I might start with you, Graham Perrett, because we've got your leader up in Queensland this week, of course. He says Australia exporting coal makes no real difference to global emissions. Do you agree?
Well, I think always a good idea to agree with the leader, but I think we understand, the Labor Party understands that we have to move the planet to a situation where we're not contributing to climate change, to global warming. We understand that. Anthony Albanese understands that, has for ever since before 2007, when John Howard and Kevin Rudd were on the same ticket in terms of reducing emissions. But we do have to get the mix right. We can't turn off the lights overnight. We can't turn off our factories overnight. We can't turn off our farming industries overnight. We've got to transition, and renewables will obviously play a big part in that. And in fact, if you look at the states that have actually committed to look like they'll be able to decrease power prices, they're those that have got the mix right and have actually been investing in renewable energies and the appropriate small batteries.
Well, except for South Australia with the smallest drop and the biggest user of renewable energy. But on this prospect that Anthony Albanese puts forward...
I think they're at capacity, South Australia. They've had the biggest solar-powered rollout in the world, is my understanding. So that's why it's...
Yeah, my point being their prices are only going down by 2%, so still high prices. But yeah. Let me ask you again, by this prospect Anthony Albanese is putting forward, would that mean that any coal exports Australia embarks upon are irrelevant? For example, mining all the coal out of the Galilee Basin, should opening up the Galilee be factored in at all to climate change?
Look, putting aside metalliferous coal, which is the majority of coal coming out of Queensland, obviously, most of the value is not thermal coal. That's more of a Hunter Valley process. Until they can work out a way to make steel without using metalliferous coal, there'll always be a coal industry that makes, parts of solar panels, that makes parts of the windmills that are actually being used for renewable.
But we've got thermal in the Galilee, Graham Perrett.
There is thermal, but we'll see whether there is a world market for seaborne coal. As you would have noticed over the last few years, the market for seaborne coal is actually decreasing as renewables become more and more of an option. And as we see already, we see countries around the world putting a focus on countries like Australia that are carbon-intensive countries, that are, per capita-wise, I think we're the second worst offender in the world. So we do have to lift our game significantly if we're going to be able to meet our targets.
Again, on that thought, so to do with coal exports, whether Australia has any difference at the moment, or indeed in the future, should there be any factoring in of climate change to exporting thermal coal, for example, opening up the entire Galilee Basin?
Well, I'm not suggesting that we rewrite the global rules, which is the country that actually creates the emissions should be responsible for the emissions. Now, there are emissions involved in terms of mining coal. We do know that, and Australia rightly puts them in our balance sheets. But I would hate to rewrite the rules of carbon accounting and suddenly make us responsible for emissions that are actually going to another country's power stations. That wouldn't work at all.
Trent Zimmerman, your thoughts on this and Anthony Albanese's push this week?
Well, I have to say, with all due respect to Graham, I think that was probably the most half-hearted defence of a leader's position I've heard for a little while, and I think it probably reflects the huge gulf that we're seeing between different parts of the Labor Party about energy policy that we've seen writ large over the weekend. But from my perspective, what we're seeing today would, I think, rightly be considered by most Queenslanders as a bit of a PR stunt, because Anthony Albanese's position on coal has been well known. In fact, just in February, he was saying that he didn't think there was a great future for coal because there wouldn't be a market for it. He was also opposed to the Adani mine and said that you'd never hear him saying something good about it. So I think that Queenslanders will rightly judge this as a bit of an exercise to try and redress the losses that they made, but there's not really much principle behind it.
All right. On the coalition side, we've got the minister over there at the latest climate conference. Now, one of the topics is going to be whether or not Kyoto carryovers can be used by countries or not. Should Australia be arguing to use carryovers? Isn't that essentially arguing for more emissions over the next few years?
Well, I think the whole system of carryovers was designed to ensure that countries had an incentive to not just meet their targets but also exceed them, and that's what Australia's done. In meeting our 2020 targets, we've not just met them, we've exceeded them, and exceeded them quite significantly. And I'd hope as we head towards 2030 that again our ambition is not just to meet those targets, but if we can, that we'll beat them as well.
But it all comes from the first agreement where we managed to get an ability to increase our emissions while others were reducing. So this is the legacy we come from. Isn't that important to mention as well?
But that was part of the global negotiations, and back at that original Kyoto conference over 20 years ago now, I think, obviously each country set targets based on its own economy, its own unique circumstances, and that's what Australia did back then. But what is important is that we have a balanced and sensible approach to addressing climate change, and I think that is about aiming high, and aiming high means trying to meet those Paris Agreement targets that we've set for ourselves.
You're not sort of looking around at your bedfellows in this sense. It'll be a whole host of countries Australia's normally aligned with saying not to use these, but we'll be on the side of Brazil and Russia, maybe China.
Well, I think what is important is that we are working towards lowering our emissions quite significantly, and if we can beat those targets, then I'm sure we will, just as we have in relation to our 2020 targets. And I think the important thing is that we have seen so much good news about how we're progressing in relation to those targets over the last couple of weeks. We've seen our emissions fall in the year just gone by. They're now significantly lower than 2005, lower than when we were elected to government. And we are also seeing what has been a significant growth in renewable energy, which is a great thing for Australia. In fact, per capita, we're spending double countries like the United Kingdom, France or Germany, and that's a sign of how seriously we're taking the challenge.
Just finally on this matter, Graham Perrett, I might go back to you. The comments from Anthony Albanese, interesting timing, is it, this week, going up and talking about coal as there's also bushfires around the country?
Look, that's the big brown land that we live in, Tom. That's the reality. We do export coal, metalliferous and thermal. It's not. It's a big part of some regions' economies, and we saw. But Anthony Albanese knows we've got to get the balance right. Sending a convoy up from under a Bob Brown flag did not help the Labor Party in the last election. Our leader understands that. He his seat's been always about pushing off the extreme voices on the left, but making sure he aims at middle Australia. And what better place to go and find out what the Labor Party stands for? Places like Barcaldine, where the Labor Party started back in 1891, places like Gladstone, where so much of our manufacturing, Maryborough, where our manufacturing is kicking off in terms of trains. So I think Anthony Albanese understands that he needs to go to regional Australia to get the balance right for the 2022 election.
Tom, I think it'll be interesting to see what...
to finish on. I am going to move on, Trent, because we're nearly out of time. Sure. But Coles, there's a boycott there urged by your colleague David Littleproud over how they've treated dairy farmers. As the government muses over what to do with environmental groups and them encouraging boycotts, will the ministers be exempt? Can they sort of do what they want?
Well, I think there's a difference between secondary boycotts, as is recognised under the law, and people making the type of points that David Littleproud did. There's quite a distinct difference, so I don't think the two are analogous.
Well, what the Prime Minister has said in his speech is he might stop people even urging people not to buy products from certain people, not the current secondary boycott under the law. Are you saying that shouldn't be countenanced?
Well, we're yet to see where that will end in a legislative form. Obviously, Christian Porter, as the Attorney-General, is working on this at the moment, and I'm not privy to what his thinking is. But we have a secondary boycott regime in Australia which is quite well established. And I would have thought the logical place to start is looking at that and whether the current exemptions that apply to some activities, for example, secondary boycotts relating to environmental causes, should persist, or whether there's a case for bringing them within the secondary boycott provisions of
What's your
existing law.
view?
I'll wait to see what the legislation looks like, I have to say.
You don't have a view, though? It's not legislation, but on that principle.
Well, I think that basically there are two types of things. There are people who are arguing a case, and that's part and parcel of the democratic process. But when you actually see people trying to forcibly interrupt the business activities of a company in Australia, then you do fall foul, under normal circumstances, of the secondary boycott rules that we expect. And we
that
have
really
seen
to
across
comment
the
on
range
this new
of...
law, though.
Well, we haven't seen the new law, so I'm not going to comment on something I haven't seen, Tom.
All right. Well, apparently it'll be out. We'll talk to you then about it. Briefly, you on this one, Graham Perrett, is there a reason to give environmentalists a carve-out? Is that a bit of a legacy issue?
Well, my understanding of we're talking about two slightly different things. You're talking about the secondary boycott is to do with industrial laws and industrial processes. This is actually a market decision. Someone going to the public and saying make a market decision, which is exactly what Minister Littleproud has actually done. I always saw the inherent flaws in what Mr Morrison signposted, virtue signalled, I guess, to his the more right-wing group in his speech. I always thought it was going to be problematic. But look, it's not the first time that the National Party's been inconsistent in the policy area.
Well, look, we'll wait to see the legislation. We'll debate it when it is out another day. Very briefly and finally, I know you're part of the Parliamentary Book Club, Graham Perrett. I'll get each of you go first, Graham, and then follow Trent. Your recommendation, summer reading for your constituents out there.
Well, look, the Parliamentary Book Club is looking at Dark Emu, which I'm just about finished off. It is sort of a weightier tone rather than a work of literature. So I look forward to discussing it at the first meeting of the Parliamentary Book Club with the New South Wales Senator Holly Hughes, who's my co-convener. That's my tip. Have a read of that.
Trent?
Well, I'm yet to join the book club, so I might have to read Dark Emu before I do. But my summer reading is a little bit nerdish, I have to confess. So I've ordered a history of Number 10 Downing Street, written by the Number 10 historian. But I'm also hoping that I might find in the Christmas stocking on Christmas Day a hint to my mother if she's watching Fitzsimon's biography of James Cook, which is probably timely considering it's the 250th anniversary of his explorations next year.
Well, there you go. Happy to provide a service. Hello to Mrs. Zimmerman out there. Trent Zimmerman, Graham Perrett.
Send the video to my mum.
Talk soon. Enjoy the summer reading.